Welcome back to my channel for another Sony episode, and this episode will be a bit longer because I will provide a full tutorial with lots of tips and tricks on the new Sony a7R Mark V. And just recently I posted a video where I compared the Sony a7R V with the Sony Alpha 1, and a lot of people said they would be interested to learn how to operationalize the camera, including how the menu is working, customizing the control wheels, the function buttons and everything. And I should say the menu of these Sony a7 cameras is a bit more complex than what you have, for instance, on a Leica SL2. And so I decided to make this tutorial and to go through the most important settings and provide a lot of tips and tricks how you can better operationalize this camera for your shooting. Let's get started. The new Sony a7R Mark V is a highly capable camera. In my opinion, it might be the best universal camera in the Sony lineup currently. And I was just shooting this camera in Singapore, and I was not shooting it with the 24mm G Master lens, which is mounted here, but the 24-70 f2.8 G Master Mark II. And I want to quickly provide a few sample images so you get appetite for this session and see what this camera is capable of, in particular night photography. Alright, let's kick off the tutorial. So first of all, in order to make this an authentic experience, I'm going to reset the camera to factory settings so we can start from scratch to set it up, to have the most important settings tweaked in the menu, to customize control wheels and control buttons so you see live how this is all working. Since I want to reset the camera now to give you from scratch the experience of setting up the camera, we need access to the menu. And there's a menu button here. If I push it, I get into the menu. Unfortunately, on Sony a7 cameras, the menu is not super intuitive. And that's why I think the first thing we need to do is understanding how to navigate through these different layers in the menu. And we have here different sections. We have a main section, and this is coming here with icons. And we have subsections, they are coming with numbers. And we have pages, and the pages contain menu entries. And if you want to navigate quickly through the main sections, you can use the front wheel and control it in that way. So I have my pointing finger now on the front wheel, and if I rotate the wheel, it jumps in the main sections always to the next section. And if I'm here and continue in the same direction, it starts from the top again. So I can very quickly navigate through the main sections here, and this works very well. Once I decided on the main section, so let's say we stay here, I can use either this control wheel or this control wheel to scroll through the subsections. So let's see here. See, if I'm scrolling down now here, it goes through the subsections in a very convenient way. And if there are several pages, like for instance here on autofocus manual focus and subsection number 1, then it switches to the next page. So it doesn't jump immediately from 1 to 2. Let's just try this. Here is the second page of subsection 1 under AF and MF. And that's the way to jump to it. And if there is no more page, then it goes to the next subsection. And here we also have several pages. Here's page number 1, page number 2, and then it jumps to subsection number 3, number 4, number 5, and so on. If you want to now have access to the menu entries on these pages, you can use either this control wheel here, which is very convenient. You can also use the joystick. And for the joystick, you can also go back into the subsection and the main section. And then with the joystick also have a quick access to all the main sections, subsections and menu entries. And that's the way this layered menu is working. Since I want to reset the camera, I use now the front wheel to go down to the very bottom here, to the last main section. And then we scroll the subsections. So we jump here from 1 to 2. And then we have setting reset. So I push now the control button here, and then I can say initialize. And this will factory reset the camera, and we can start to set up from scratch. Let's now do this. Initialize. It asks for confirmations, restores settings to their defaults, and deletes registered data. So if you have set up the camera before, don't do it. You will lose all the settings if you have not stored them somewhere. So go to enter. And then it asks again, just to be on the safe side, so you cannot accidentally reset or initialize your camera. And I go into enter. And now it's resetting the camera, and it's like factory reset as if you would have taken it out of the box. So you have to start from scratch with your setup. So this one here is now factory reset, and I always go for English language. And then we have here privacy notice. You need to confirm that you understand that. And then we can set the area, the date and the time. So I go into enter, and my time zone is Berlin, Paris. That's fine. So we confirm. You get here always some guidance what you need to push for cancel or OK. And I want to have date, month, year. That's the way we write it here in Europe. And then we can set up the date and the time. The date is today, the 18th of December. It's the last Sunday before Christmas. So we go down here to 18. And then we go to December, so 12, and it is still 2022. So this is set up. On the current time, you can decide whether you want to be in the 12-hour system or in the 24-hour system. This is currently set up to 24 hours. If I touch here, it's now in the 12-hour system, and I can switch back to 24-hour system by touching again. And then we can go here to, so this is then 20. 20, it's 2024. So we go here to 24. If you press and hold it, it changes the numbers very quickly. So it's really not a lot of time effort here. 2024, in the meanwhile, it's 2025. We can go here, and now we can confirm by pressing the center button here on this control element. And then you get here an interesting option to choose. And if you shoot the camera on a tripod and don't have it hand hold in shooting, then it will very likely not get as warm as if you have your hands wrapped around the camera. And since these cameras here in the Sony lineup, the Sony a7R and the Sony a7R Mark V can actually record 8K, the camera might become warm. And here you can say, if it is on a tripod, would you like to extend the auto power off temperature to high to allow for a bit more temperature before the camera is switching off. I never had this issue that it automatically switches off, but you can be here on a bit on the aggressive side. So let's say set now. The temperature of the device may rise to prioritize recording time. Would you like to change this setting? Yes, I do. All right, and then we can here connect the camera to Imaging Edge Mobile, which helps you to remotely shoot the camera. I say I do, register this later, and then we are good to go. Let's now see how to set up the display brightness and the brightness of the electronic viewfinder. So we go into the menu, and in the menu we scroll down in the main sections all the way to the very last icon here. And then we go through the pages until we find display settings. So here we have monitor brightness, and this is currently on manual. And here we have several options. First of all, if I just push the control button here, I can decide between manual, which is enabling me to actually choose a different value here. Or I can say I'm in bright sunlight. So let's go up to this menu entry here again. And then I can say this is sunny weather, and then the display will brighten up. Have a look. Much better. In particular, good for this tutorial. Now, if you do that, it will consume more power, of course, because a brighter display means more power consumption. We can do the same on the viewfinder, of course, but in order to do that, I need to look through the viewfinder, which I cannot do currently. So when I push that here, it says look at the viewfinder while setting the brightness, which makes a lot of sense, of course. And I cannot do this here in the tutorial, but the setting is kind of exactly the same. Now here in the subsection, there are a bunch of other functions how you can tweak the EVF and the LCD display. And first of all, you can select Finder Monitor here. You can go to Auto. That means if your eye is approaching the EVF, then it decides to display the content in the EVF. If you get your eye off the EVF, it will show everything in the LCD. You can also go for electronic viewfinder only or monitor only, which is then a manual setting. I recommend to leave this at auto at all times because it's just convenient. Then we have here also a color temperature adjustment. That's only for the EVF here, for the electronic viewfinder. And you can make the image as you preview it a bit colder or a bit warmer. And you can try this out by looking through the viewfinder and adjusting it. Then we have a viewfinder magnification, and the viewfinder magnification basically means that if you go here and go to zoom out, then your viewing angle, the way you look through the viewfinder, will become narrower, and that's maybe easier if you wear glasses. I keep this at standard here. Then we can choose on the display quality between standard and high. I leave this at standard because this EVF is really good enough and the display is also good enough. And on the finder frame rate, you can go here for a high frame rate, or you can keep it at standard. And if you go to high, and in the same way here on the display quality to high, it will consume more power. So I recommend to leave this both at standard, which is better. What you should know is there is kind of a dependence between the two. If you decide for finder frame rate to be high, let's do this quickly, then display quality is grayed out and you can no longer choose whether you want a high or standard. It's just overwritten. And that is something you need to know, because otherwise it will confuse you that all of a sudden something is grayed out here. So if you have that at standard, you can go for high quality, no problem. But the moment in time you go here for high, it flips back to standard and is grayed out on display quality. Nothing you can do about that. What are the things I set up first when I get a camera like the Sony a7R V out of the box? So what we need to do now is we need to go to the camera main section here, and we can do this via the front wheel. I showed this before. We can either just go from the top here, or we can also go in the other direction from here. And then we have here basic settings on image quality. So first of all, I always stay here in the JPEG format, although the HEIF is more efficient, but I want to have this in JPEG. Then we have image quality settings. Here we have a first menu entry, which is currently on JPEG only, and that's something you want to avoid, right? If you go out and shoot with that camera now and you forget to set this setting to RAW, then you have only JPEG images and you will have a lack of quality later in post. So let's push the button here, and then we go to RAW and JPEG if you want to have that. If you want to save storage on the capacity of your memory cards here, go to RAW only and then do the trick in post-processing. I typically want to have here RAW and JPEG for a quick preview of my image, and that's what I should choose here. Then we have the RAW file type, and here we have different options. Uncompressed, that's a huge file size. Then 3 stages of lossless compression: large, medium, small, and compressed. In my opinion, uncompressed is always superior, but you will not notice any difference if you go to lossless compression large here, which is what we can choose if we want. And I think in my experience this is good enough, but you know, since I'm a very pedantic person, I will go to uncompressed here. But if you want to save some storage capacity on your cards here, go to lossless compression large. It's good enough for sure. Then we have here the JPEG quality. I go here to extra fine to get as many details as possible in my JPEG image. But again, this influences to some extent your file size. And then we can also go for the resolution here. And clearly, since I do all cropping in post, I go for 60 megapixel here, and then we go to OK, and then image quality settings are completed. Let's quickly go through some other basic settings here. First of all, we have aspect ratio. And aspect ratio can be set to 3:2, 4:3, 16:9, and a square, and it will only impact the JPEG, not the RAW file. So if you go here, for instance, for 16:9, your JPEG, since I'm shooting in RAW and JPEG, will be cropped into a 16:9 aspect ratio, but the RAW file will still show the full sensor readout, which is nice. I typically leave that here because, as I said, all cropping happens in post. Doesn't make sense to crop a JPEG here up front. Then we have video formats on file format. So this is currently set to an HD definition. And I can set this here, for instance, even to 8K or to 4K. That's the highest quality on 4K. And then we have also on the movie settings here, the frame rate and the record setting. And on the record setting, I can go to whatever I want. I typically go for 100M here, 422 10-bit, because that's my choice. That's what I'm used to work with. And then you realize the recording frame rate here is grayed out. It's always at 50p. Don't get confused by that. If you go back here and go to a less demanding standard, let's say 4K only here, then you will be able to tweak the frame rate. So let's go here and now you can choose between 50p and 25p in the way you might want to do it. But I keep it here at the highest standard for 4K, and then frame rate here is just grayed out. The next menu entry in the camera menu under subsection number 1 below movie settings is APS-C and Super 35mm shooting. And this is currently on auto, which means that if you mount here, for instance, in still images an APS-C lens, then the camera will automatically crop for an APS-C size area on this full frame sensor, which is what's only used. And I actually recommend to set this to off, because I never want to accidentally end up in a situation where I shoot in a full frame setup all of a sudden with using only part of the sensor cropped to an APS-C format, or in video to a Super 35mm. And if you mount a lens which has been calculated for an APS-C, for instance in still images format, you should consciously switch this on, but I would not leave it on auto, because that might create once in a while a very bad surprise on the outcome of your images or videos. Next menu entry is on noise reduction, and it's about long exposure noise reduction, and that is typically set to on in the standard setting. Now if you shoot, let's say, a time lapse at night, you might want to switch this off, because then you don't have a dark frame subtraction which needs the same exposure time as the actual shot on the frame before. And let's say you shoot with 20 seconds at night, then you take the exposure 20 seconds, then the dark frame subtraction kicks in if you have noise reduction here on, and that costs you another 20 seconds before you can take the next real frame. So it's very useful that you can switch it off here, but on the standard situation it should be on. And you have also, of course, a high ISO noise reduction here, which you can set to normal, low or off, and I typically have this on normal. The next setting here is HLG, still image, and that sounds a bit cryptic, but HLG stands for hybrid log gamma, and is actually the standard for HDR images. Now currently it's grayed out, and the reason is that this setting only is activated if you shoot in HEIF, and we have set this here to JPEG and not to HEIF, and we also need to change here and move away from RAW. So let's go here to JPEG, and then let's activate here, let's say HEIF 422, and then if we go back here to this menu entry, we can now choose whether HLG, so hybrid log gamma, is off or whether it is on. But I don't use that feature because I clearly want to shoot in RAW, and I also want to have JPEG and not HEIF. So let's set this off. Let's go back, quickly correct it so that I don't mess up my newly set up camera here, and then everything is in good order and shape. That's it. And now, since I'm back in my normal shooting mode here in terms of image quality settings, this menu entry here, HLG, is again grayed out because no HEIF format is what I'm shooting. Color space is straightforward. You can choose between sRGB or Adobe RGB. That depends on your preferences for what you have also in post-processing later, when you then work on the images you shot. And then we have a last basic setting, which is lens compensation. And here I recommend to have everything on auto, because then the camera software will do a lot of tricks which you otherwise have to apply in post-processing. The next basic feature I want to discuss are power saving options, and for this we go into the menu, and then on the main section, using the front control wheel, we go to the very bottom to the settings main section, and then we can use the rear control wheel to actually go down to page number 8. And on page number 8 we first of all have auto monitor off, and I have set this to does not turn it automatically off, but you can choose that if you don't use the camera, after 2 seconds the monitor goes off, after 5, 10 seconds and 1 minute, and that saves power consumption, of course. Going back from here, we come to the next entry, which is power save start time, and that is a bit of an unfortunate formulation like sometimes in the Sony camera menus, because what it actually addresses has nothing to do with a start time. It's the interval the camera waits until it switches to a low power consumption mode. And you can switch this to off, then the camera will always be ready to 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes of inactivity, the camera will go into low power mode, or 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute and 10 seconds. Let's try this out. Let's go to 10 seconds here. And as long as I'm staying in the camera menu, nothing will happen. But if I go back into shooting mode here, let's wait for 10 seconds. So we just need to count down 10 seconds, then the camera should switch automatically into low power mode. So let's see and wait. Alright, now the camera is in low power mode, and that of course saves battery life. If you want to reactivate it, you just push any button here, for instance the shutter release button, and then it should wake up instantly again. The problem is if you want to wake it up immediately after it went to sleep, then you will have to wait for some time. So let's wait another 10 seconds. Now it switches to low power mode, and if I now want to activate it, you see it takes some time. And there is a transition time between the full power mode and the low power mode. So I would not recommend to set this to 10 seconds because it will annoy you a lot. The camera will go to sleep all the time. And if you instantly want to wake it up, it will take a few seconds until this happens. So I typically would recommend to set this to 5 minutes, for instance. Or if you want to be a bit more aggressive on power consumption, to 30 minutes. And then, you know, if you have a really long time of inactivity, the camera will do its thing and put itself into low power mode. Next entry here is an interesting feature which not many people will be aware of. And I also zoomed out a little bit on my filming camera to make this better transparent to you what happens here. So power saved by monitor, both linked, means that whenever I close the monitor in a way that it is protected from scratches here. So here, this surface here is protecting it, and the LCD is actually facing the inside of the camera body, it will go instantly into power save mode. Let's have a look. Now the camera switched into power save mode. And if I want to wake it up again, I just have to open the monitor. You see it's dark for a moment, and now it's waking up in a couple of seconds. Here we go. So it woke up, and that's what means if you have in the menu entry here both linked. You can also choose in the options here that it returns if you open, that it goes into power save if you close, but then you don't have it linked in both directions, so closing and opening. And you can also say that it does not link at all, which we can just quickly try out. So now if I take the monitor here, I rotate it, I get it back in, it will stay awake, it will not go into sleep or low power consumption mode. If I open it up, it's immediately there, and that's the way this feature works here. I think actually both linked is the right setting here. I like that feature a lot because you can steer via the monitor whether your camera goes into low power mode or just stays awake. And then the last menu entry here is auto power off temperature, and that's something we saw when we initially set up the camera because we were asked by the camera if we want to have this on high or on standard. And what it means is on high, it waits longer, allows for a higher temperature in video shooting before it automatically switches off the camera to protect everything that's inside the camera. And I have this on high, so a bit more on the aggressive side. And if you have not decided for high at the standard setting at the very initialization of the camera, you can do so here in that menu entry. You get a warning, but then you're good to go to have auto power off temperature on high. Let's talk now about touch functionality, and we go into the menu, we stay on the main section on settings, and then we go up on the pages until we come to page number 5, which then takes us into touch operation, sensitivity, touch panel pad, and so on. And I'm going to walk through all of them to explain you how they work and how you can tweak the settings. The first menu entry is touch operation, and here you can deactivate touch at all. If you go to off, and whatever you do here, nothing will happen. You can touch whatever you want. There is no reaction. Even if you go into the function menu, which we are going to cover later, if you tap here, nothing will happen. And if you are on playback mode, so let's go here into playback. We have an image here from New York. You cannot pinch to zoom, you cannot swipe, nothing will happen. The touch functionality is completely disabled. Let's go back into the menu and let's activate now on playback only. If we do that and we go back into shooting mode in live view, still nothing works here. We cannot touch, no reaction to my touch or finger taps. But if we go into playback mode, we can, for instance, now zoom in here. If I tap this, you get all the details of this image. I can zoom out. I can also pinch to zoom and pinch back. I can also swipe between different images. Let me do that. So here we can swipe no matter what. We can always use the usual touch functionality in playback mode like you're used to doing it on your smartphone, for instance. All right, let's go back into live view. Let's go back into the menu. And now let's say we want to have touch operation on. And then it's not only working in playback mode like you see here. So again, let me zoom into that picture, maybe here. Double tap, let me zoom out, double tap, and so on. All the gestures you're used to from your smartphone. You can also use it now in live view. And if I tap, for instance, now on the background lights here, they will become sharp and in focus, and the focus moves away from my foreground, which is my The Witcher model here, to the background lights. And it also says here tracking cancel. That means it's now in some kind of tracking mode, and that can confuse you because that's the setting what you have if you take the camera out of box. And in order to cancel the tracking, you have to push the control button here at the center, and then you see it moves back to the foreground. I could now easily focus by halfway pressing the shutter button. I will come back to that tracking feature later in the video or in a moment. Let's go back into the menu. So we have touch operation on, and then we have touch sensitivity, and there is standard and sensitive. Sensitive is very useful if you want to operate the camera with gloves. If you don't wear gloves in winter, for instance, when it is cold outside, you don't need sensitive, just keep it to standard. Let's go back here to the menu. Then we have touch panel and touchpad. And that's an interesting notion Sony is using here. So for instance, whenever you operate with your finger on the LCD screen, that area is called a touch panel. And that means you are in live shooting via the LCD and the live view on the LCD screen. If you use the electronic viewfinder, so you have your eyes close to the electronic viewfinder, then you can use the LCD screen as a touchpad in order to move your focus field, for instance. And here we have now a couple of options. Let's go into that menu here. And then we have first of all both valid. And both valid means that whenever you have your eye on the electronic viewfinder, you can use the LCD as a touchpad to move your focus field, for instance. And if both valid is activated, you also, if you don't shoot via EVF, but shoot in live view on the LCD, you can also use the LCD as a touch panel for your touch operations. If we move here to touch panel only, then only if you are shooting in live mode with the LCD, and if you are not having your eye on the electronic viewfinder, you have that touch functionality. And if you move to touchpad only, it's the same story reversed. Your LCD is not used as a touch panel, but if you have your eye on the electronic viewfinder, you can use the LCD with the touch functionality as a touchpad. Now the question is, what's the right setting for you? For me, actually, it is touch panel only, which is also the default selection if you get the camera out of box. And the reason is that if I'm here in live view and I look at the LCD, don't have my eye on the EVF, I'm happy to choose the touch functionality to operate the camera. But if I have my eye on the electronic viewfinder, I have my pointing finger on the shutter release button, I cannot reach a lot of the LCD anyway. Now you can tweak what area is used as a touchpad, I show that in a moment, but for me that feature is just not feasible, so I keep it here on the menu entry on touch panel only. But it's up to you, of course, and how you want to get used to it. If you shoot via the EVF, how to move the touch functionality and the operations via your finger while your eye is on the EVF. The next setting is touch panel settings, and there is only one thing you can tweak here, namely a swipe up gesture. That means if I swipe up with my finger on the LCD screen, it opens the function or FN menu in the same way as if I would have pushed this button here. So let's first of all have this at off, and if I swipe up, nothing will happen except that the focus field will try to move and lock on. So see, nothing happens here, then the tracking cancel is available again. But if I set this to on here, then that swipe up gesture should actually work and bring up the function menu. Typically you have this on that button here. So here it comes up, hiding it, coming up, hiding it, but let's nevertheless try it out. So if we swipe up, the FN menu pops up in the way we programmed it in the settings. For me, this setting definitely is at off, because we'll later see in the customization of function buttons that there is no other function I can assign to the FN button than just bringing up the FN menu. So there's also no need for an alternative way to get into the FN menu via gesture. And by the way, remember what I said previously, namely touch panel addresses the LCD if your eye is not on the EVF, and touchpad settings, which is what we will look at next, is if you have your eye on the EVF and you still want to, with a selected area on the LCD screen, for instance, steer your focus field. So on touchpad settings, we can now go into that menu, and first of all, we can select whether this should also work in vertical orientation or portrait mode, and we can switch this on or off. It's currently on, but it can be confusing if you have rotated the camera by 90 degrees to still get the operations right. Then we can choose between touch position mode, and we can go for absolute position or relative position. Absolute position is still on here, but if you want to go for relative position, it might be sometimes a bit easier because it's on the increment you are moving, for instance, the focus field. I personally don't use the touchpad mode. That's why the touchpad position mode setting here is not really relevant for me. I recommend that you try this out and see what's working in your workflow. And then we have operation area, and that's interesting. You can go here for the whole screen, which is not feasible for me. See, if I have my pointing finger on the shutter release button, I cannot get more far than here on this right hand side of the LCD screen to use this part here as a touchpad. So that would probably for me the right setting. You also have it even smaller if your hand is smaller, and then you have also upper right, lower right, left, one half of the screen that would then be here. So you would not have your hand around the lens like I typically have it, but you would have it here and operate it with your left hand thumb, or you would have it even smaller on the left hand side, or you would have it in the upper or lower left. So there are lots of options. I think that is something where a recommendation is pointless, because you have to try this out, you have to experiment. If you want to use first of all the touchpad when you have your eye on the EVF, then if you want to use it, where do you want to have your operations taking place? Right hand side, left hand side, upper, lower corners, and how large this area of touchpad operation should be for you. And then last but not least, we have the touch function in shooting. And here we have currently activated touch tracking. That's how it comes out of the box. And let me illustrate this again. Let's go here to the background, and then it will start to track the background lights. So they are fixed mounted on the wall. Nothing exciting will happen here. But that's what it is. And I can stop tracking by pushing the center button here. There are other options now we can try out. So there is touch focus only. If we go on that one, it should actually focus where I touch or tap on the LCD screen. Now, when you have set this up and you touch somewhere, don't be disappointed, because you need to still half press the shutter button. So let me try to illustrate this again. That's the way it works. I looked it up in the manual, no other way to do it. Point the focus field where you want with your touch, and then focus there by half pressing the shutter button. But if you want to accelerate your workflow in a way that if you tap here somewhere and you want the focus to switch to there immediately without half pressing the shutter button and taking the shot, that's an option you can take in the menu. So if we go back here, then we have here an option which is called touch shutter. Now this is grayed out, and it says it's not available in the way this is set up currently on the focus area. So we need to go into focus area, which is a topic by itself I'm going to cover later. And in the focus area, let's say we want to have here white, and then we should actually get this option no longer grayed out here. And you see touch shutter. So let's activate this. And now when I tap somewhere on the LCD screen, I don't have to have my pointing finger on the shutter release button. It will focus and immediately take the shot. Let's have a look here on the background lights. Boom, shot taken. Foreground model, shot taken. That's the way it works. On playback, you see the shot has been taken in the way I want to have it. So that's a way to accelerate that whole workflow without even having your pointing finger on the shutter release button. You just go on touch focus here in the way we activated it, and then wherever you tap, it will immediately take the shot and have the focus spot on that point in the area where you tapped. Quite easy, isn't it? Of course, I can also deactivate all touch functions in shooting. So if I go to off here and go back to live view, I see here in this little icon that the touch on my hand here and the pointing finger is off. And now I can toggle through all the options I just have chosen in the menu. So this is to place my focus field, then I half press the shutter button and focus, and I'm good to go. Same way on my model here. Sorry, that wasn't placed in the right way. Half press the shutter button, by the way, jumps immediately to the eye, which is what I'm going to show later in the video. And then we can toggle further here. So now we have here the tracking. So if I focus on my model, it starts the tracking of the face. Then I can deactivate the tracking or cancel it by pushing the center button. And then one more option we have here is, sorry, let me toggle through this again, is the direct shot without having my pointing finger on the shutter release button. So if I point here on the model, it takes the photo immediately, and then in playback, I have it here and can zoom in and what have you. Let's quickly do this. Pinpoint sharp, right? So that's the way to go. You don't have to go to the menu, just use that functionality here. And if you want to quickly shut down all touch functionality, just switch it to off. That's all I wanted to say on touch functionality. I walked through all these menu entries, and I think it's really a bit more complex than you would assume at first sight. Let's now talk about customization of the A7R5, and there are so many different ways you can customize this wonderful camera to make it truly your own camera, your own tool for your individual tailor-made workflow in photography. And the first topic I want to talk about is how to create your own custom tailor-made menu. And there is a dedicated icon for that. If we go along the main sections and scroll up here to that very first symbol, which indicates favorites, then you have an option to add items here, delete them, sort, create pages. You can really build and construct your own menu with the most important menu entries you want to have at your disposal at all time with an easy access. So let's collect some items here under add item, and I don't need JPEG, HEIF, I leave this at JPEG at all times. But I want to have image quality settings, file format, movie settings, slow motion and so on. So let's start with, let's say, file format here. And let's say I add this to this location and then it's added. Let's continue. And let's say we want to have movie settings, and movie settings we can now add either at the end of the list or at the beginning of the list. You see that red line here jumping up and down. And let's say we have this here at the end of the list, so I add it here. That's also added. Now I also said I want to have image quality settings, and let's add this now here at the very beginning of the list, so at the top. So I move up this red line here, you see this jumping up, and let's add it here. And let's see what we created so far. So if I go into live view and shooting mode, and then going back into the menu here and going one step to the left, I see here my menu 1. I also have still my menu settings, so I can continue to add items and what have you, but my menu 1 now has these 3 entries in the order how I assembled them into the list, and that's my first tailor-made menu screen here. Let's add one more item, so let's go to my menu setting, add item, and let's get here the slow motion and quick motion settings. Let's add them under the movie settings, and if later on I decide that this is not what I want, I can go back here. So first of all, you see here menu back is something I can also operate by touch, and then I can say I want to delete an item, and then it asks me what item I want to delete, and that one I just added, so let's delete it away again. Let's push it here, delete this item, okay, and then the list again has the 3 original settings I stored in that list. I can also say my whole page is crap and go back here into my menu settings and say delete page. And then I say this is the page, my menu 1, which I don't like. I made a lot of mistakes when I assembled these items into a list, so I can delete it. And then if I press OK, this list is gone and is history. And now I have to start all over from scratch to add my items. In order not to bore you, I restored my list now because I don't want to become overly repetitive. But there are more things I can do. I can also resort entries in that menu here. So let's go here to sort item. And let's pick, for instance, movie settings. And then you see the red line here. So this is the position where it jumps to. I can get it there, or I can get it here, or I can even get it to a new menu page. And you see here there are 6 different menu pages I can actually populate here. And that's quite nice. Gives me a lot of flexibility. I'm going to show you that in a moment, how that works. But for the time being, let's say I want to have movie settings at the top of the list. So I do it, and then it's reordered in the way you see it here on screen. Let's now look into how to create different menu pages and make this even more tailor-made. Let's say I want to have one menu here for still images and one menu for video and movies. And let's try to arrange this now. Let's say I want to have movie settings on a different page. So we go here into my menu settings and we say sort item. Let's pick movie settings again. And let's move it down now. Now it's here, now it's below file format, and now it jumps to my menu 2. So let's put it there, let's add it to this location, and let's do the same with file format, which is also video setting. So let's pick it, let's move it down, and let's move it into my menu 2, and let's move it below movie settings. So here we go. And if I now look at what I created, I have now my menu 1 for still images, image quality settings, and I have my menu 2 for movie and video settings, which is the movie settings and the file format. Quite nice, quite flexible. Let's add one more item here. So let's go to add item, and let's this time go into drive mode. And on drive mode, let's say we want to have the interval shooting function. So select it, but now I can here immediately go and let's say I want to have my menu number 5, because later I want to fill in something under my menu 3 and 4. So I can add this to this location, and then it's added. And then if I go back here, I have now 3 pages, my menu 1, my menu 2, my menu 5, and on my menu 5 I have interval shooting functions. So that's the way this works. I think I illustrated this in detail now, and you can figure out your way yourself to make this camera your own on the favorites menu. There is one more thing I want to mention, namely here is one option where it says display from my menu off and on. And if it is off, and I'm let's say in the menu on the main section on, let's go to autofocus and manual focus. And let's go somewhere here, and I choose this, for instance, whatever it is. I go back into live view and shooting, and then if I press the menu button again, it takes me back to that function where I left the menu, which is quite nice. Let's try this again. Let's go here, for instance, to the camera menu, and on the camera menu, let's go to aspect ratio. And if I now go into shooting mode and press menu, it comes back to that setting. I think that's the most convenient way to have it. But you have the option, if we go up here into the favorites menu again, and we go back into my menu settings and I say now display from my menu into on, then whenever I'm in shooting mode and go back into menu, it goes immediately into the favorites menu here. So let's say I'm here under image quality settings, I leave the menu, I go on the menu button, it takes me there. And if I go somewhere else on the menu, let's now go here to autofocus, manual focus again, and let's say we go here into autofocus illuminator and we leave it. Now if I press the menu button, it will not take me back to that last setting, but into my own tailor-made menu, which is the image quality settings. And that's the way what this setting is for. If you go here and have this on, it always comes to your favorites. If you have it on off, it will always get back to the menu where it was left before, which I think is the more convenient setting. Let's now talk about the FN menu settings, and you get into this by pushing the FN button and then it shows up, and if you push the button again, it hides away. As I showed in section 21 of this video, you can also swipe up to get into this FN menu here if you have set this up accordingly in the touch functionality, which is here under touch panel settings, and then you go to swipe up and then it opens the FN menu in the way I showed before in section 21. But as said there, I will not use the swiping up feature because there is no other function I can assign to the FN button than just bringing up the FN menu and hiding it. What can we do with the FN menu? It gives us easy access to settings we prefer to have at disposal at all times. And the first one here is the drive mode. I've, by the way, already customized this, so these are not the original settings out of the box. And we can customize this further. I'm going to show this in a moment. But how to operate it is simple. You can use the joystick and you can then push here, for instance, and get up the settings here on the left-hand side, for instance, on the focus mode, so single, automatic, continuous, and what have you. You can also use this 4-direction control, going up, going down, going sideways. That's all fine. And then if you want to change something, let's say here on metering mode, you just rotate. And then it gives you the options here and you can scroll through. So spot standard, for instance, sender, multi-metering mode, and so on. You can also, if you have selected a field, let's say here, for instance, on drive mode, use the front control wheel here and go through the same settings as what we just saw with this wheel here. So there are many ways to operate the FN menu, and probably there are more ways than what I've just shown here, but these are the most common ones. As I said before, I already made some selections here and customized my FN menu. But what if I want to change it? What if face memory here is something I don't use that often and want to replace it by something I use more frequently? Then we go into the menu, and in the menu we are on the main sections in the settings, and in the subsections we go up to page number 3. And then we have here FN menu settings, and if I go into that, I get FN menu settings to be customizable for still images as well as for movie shooting. And I can do them individually and there is no dependence between the two. So what I wanted to change here on still images is face memory and replace it by something else. And there are also here 3 layers. There is a main layer here, and then there is a sub layer, and then there are entries which I can choose to appear as a function on this particular field. And let's say I want to go here to image quality, and I want to have here maybe under file, create a new folder. Let's say that's the one I choose. If I press now the center button, you see my icon here changed, and that's the way to customize this. Let's do another one here. Let's say white balance is not what I want. Let's go here to color tone. Let's say we want to switch here on or off the derange optimizer. Let's choose it, and then you see how these 2 fields in this 2x6 matrix changed, and that's the way to use it. If I go now back here and push the FN button, I have here now my create new folder, and here I have the derange optimizer in the way I customized it. If you're interested in my final selection for the function FN menu, here it is. So I have on the first position the drive mode, then focus mode, focus area, subject recognition and autofocus, face priority in multi-metering mode, recognition target, then right left eye selection, face memory, metering mode, which is important. I toggle this in different ways all the time. Image quality settings, interval shooting, and pixel shift multi-shooting. And that's the way I go for it for still images. And in the same way as I customized this here and I showed and demonstrated to you, you can also customize now your FN menu in movie and video shooting. Let's now talk about customizing buttons, control wheels, and what have you. And first of all, a lot of buttons here are pre-configured when you take the camera out of box. For instance, here you see markings ISO, display. This here is for drive mode. So let's try this out. If I go here to the right hand side it brings me the ISO menu. And I can also choose here on the ISO range what is the minimum, what is the maximum if I'm on auto ISO. Then I have the native base ISO of the camera 50, and then it goes up all the way. Let's scroll through this very quickly, which becomes very bright. So we are here now at 64,000, 80,000 ISO and 102,400. So that's quite a lot to offer here on the sensitivity settings. Then we have here on the left hand side drive mode. If I go into that, I get my drive mode settings, and I also configured this as you saw before on the FN menu here on the upper left hand side, and that is of course a duplication, so I could change that if I wanted. And then we have the display button, and it toggles through different views on the live view here. So here we have a different view. We have here a histogram, for instance, coming up. We have here level metering the camera. We have here an oversight screen with all the settings we've chosen so far, and then we are back in the original mode. And that's the way to toggle through the display settings, and that is of course convenient. The good news is we can customize them individually for still image shooting and for video shooting, which is then the second menu here. So let's go into that, and then we get here an illustration on the right hand side of the camera, and we have basically 5 pages. So this is page number 1 of 5, page number 2, page number 3, 4 and 5. And on all of these pages we can customize certain buttons here for certain functions or features. Let's start with page number 1. To get into it, you either push the center button here, or you just go to the right here, and then you come into auto exposure lock. That's this one here. You see here a tiny little orange marking of the button we are talking about. We have the back button focus here. We have white balance, which is C1 here on the camera. We have focus mode, which is this button here, sorry. And then we have touch operation select, which is actually at the trash bin here. So let's try this out. I think we looked already in back button focus. Auto exposure lock gives you here a little symbol with an asterisk. So you see that. Then we have here white balance. This comes up here, so we can scroll through our white balance settings. And then we have here the focus mode, which I also have on a different place on the camera. And then we have here below on the trash bin, we have the touch operation off or touch operation on, which we can also toggle by this little icon we saw before. But the difference is if you do it via the trash bin, it's basically gone. So here is also switched off, but if I push the trash bin button again, this icon is gone, and then I cannot accidentally by touch activate or deactivate certain touch functions. Moving on to page number 2, we have here the focus standard on the joystick. Then we have the center button not set to anything special than just the choice or selection button. We have the drive mode, which I showed before. We have the ISO mode, and you see here again this orange marking on that little graphic here. And then we have another function not set. So if you want to set that now, we push the center button, and then we have again main layers here. We have sub layers and we have entries. And if I want to now assign a function or feature to pushing this down here, let's select something. Let's go here maybe into, let me see what I want here. I think silent mode is good. Let's go to switch to silent mode. I activate it, and now you see it's populated from nothing assigned before or not set, as it also says under 2, switch to silent mode. Let's try this out quickly. Let's go into that, and now we have silent mode on, silent mode off, and that's the way you can customize these type of functions. On page number 3, we see buttons at the top of the camera, so the movie button, which is also indicated by a red circle, and custom function button number 2. And we also have, of course, the button on the lens, because these G Master lenses like the 24 1.4, which is currently mounted, they also have a function button on the lens, and that is pre-populated typically with focus hold, which is not what I want. I'd rather want to have here exposure and then want to have exposure, auto exposure lock. And let's assign this here. And if we go back now here and push that button on the lens, you will see that asterisk coming up here, which we saw before, which indicates as long as I press and hold it, I have auto exposure lock activated on the camera. The same customization options we have for movie shooting. So if we go in here, we again have 5 pages, and we can individually assign functions to these buttons and control wheels so that they suit the workflow in our video shooting. If you take the camera freshly out of box, most of these customizations here follow the settings which are applied in still image shooting. So you see here this little camera icon in brackets, and if I scroll down, by the way, I also can do this instead of using this control here. I can also go by the control wheel here on the rear side. You see most of it is set to the same settings as what we customized before here under still image shooting. So that's kind of coupled, but we can also decouple it in different settings. So let's try this out. Let's say, for instance, I want to go here on custom button number 2 and want to change this. I can also individually choose whatever I want. So there is no need to bind this to the settings we have under the still image section. In playback mode, we have much less options. If I go into that, we have rear side 3 buttons to customize and top side 2 buttons. And you also see here follow custom. That means it follows the settings we have, for instance, the still image mode. So not much to do here. There are a couple of more things I want to point out on customization of buttons. And the first one is, let's go into still image shooting. There are certain elements which cannot be customized. And I mentioned before that the FN button is one of them. So let's go into here and then we follow the orange dot here. And you see the FN button, no matter what I do. So here I'm currently now on focus standard, which is the joystick here. But if I go further down, it jumps immediately to the center button here. So the FN button is omitted and I cannot assign any other function to FN than just bringing up the FN menu. And that's why I also don't need that swipe gesture, which we looked into under touch functionality. Another setting on buttons which is also omitted here is not only the FN button, but also the display setting here. You see it jumps from the joystick immediately to the center button and then goes to the left hand side, the right hand side and the down button here, and the display button is omitted. So there's no way to give this here a different meaning than just talking through the different display views. And the second remark I want to make is you can also customize control wheels, and that's at the 5th page here on custom key dial settings. And first of all, we can here checkbox whether we want a separation of shooting in fully manual mode or in program mode, in aperture priority or shutter priority. And if I checkbox this, I get a second column here, which gives me then control. So I can distinguish between fully manual mode and automatic or semi-automatic modes. Let's quickly go through the default settings here. So I'm in the manual mode column here. And then it says in brackets what my front control wheel, which is number 1 here, is doing. It namely controls the aperture value. And of course, if I have an aperture ring on the lens, like here on the 1.4 24mm G Master, I can also use that aperture ring. And then on the rear control wheel on the left hand side, we can change the shutter speed. And on the second, on the right hand side, the rear control wheel, we can do exposure compensation. That's the way it is set up now in the column for manual mode. And on all other modes, we see here that we can control, if we are in aperture priority, the aperture value on the front and the rear control wheel. And if we are in shutter speed priority, we can control the shutter speed on the rear and the front wheel. And we have exposure compensation on the same wheel as where it was sitting on fully manual mode. Of course, I can customize this now. I don't want to change these settings in the first 2 rows, so in 1 and 2, because they are natural choices of what should happen if I operate the control wheels. But let's say in fully manual mode, I don't want to have exposure compensation. I want to have ISO here, so let's push the center button. Let's go into exposure and then let's select ISO here, and then it changed. You see it here in the entry on this table. It changed, and if I'm in fully manual mode now, I can control with this wheel here, which is indicated with an orange color here, the ISO value. That's actually all I wanted to say on customization of buttons and control wheels. And you see this camera body is highly flexible. You can create your own workflow here and set this up in the way best possible suiting your shooting and helping you to take great images. Since we just spent a lot of time in the main section on settings and subsection number 3, let's look into something else which is worthwhile a tip, namely a different set for stills and movies. And that is an interesting one because normally, for instance, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, exposure compensation, metering mode, white balance, and so on, that all is coupled and bound together means what you set up under still images will also be the same setting under movie shooting. Let's now try this out. So I'm here in aperture priority and I've set my aperture to f1.4. And on the menu here, I've not checkboxed anything. So now we should have a one-on-one relationship between parameters set in still images and they should be carried over into movie shooting. Let's try this out. I go here into movie mode and then you see the same aperture as what's selected on still image shooting. Let's now go back to still images. and let's go into that menu here and let's change the setting for the aperture. So I simply checkbox this here. Don't forget to push OK, otherwise it will not take that value as checkboxed. And what happens now is if I, let's say, stop down here to an f4.0 and switch into movie mode, it still has the former value of f1.4. So a separation took place here. Let's here stop down to an f2.8 and go back into still images. It still has the before chosen f4.0. So we have separated now for the aperture in particular the settings between still image shooting and movie shooting. If I now go back to the menu and deactivate that checkbox here, so I take it away again, don't forget to press OK here, otherwise it will not be set. And then we have here in still image shooting f4.0, and you remember before on movie shooting we were at f2.8, but now if we switch to movie shooting it's again f4.0. So we have coupled it back to the still image shooting. That's the way this works, and is quite interesting that you can do this, and I like this feature a lot. It looks like a minor thing, a minor tweak, but it can actually change the world if you switch a lot between still image shooting and movie shooting. By the way, if you want to replicate this exercise for yourself, make sure if you have an aperture ring on your Sony lens, like I have it here on my G Master 1.4 24mm, to have the aperture into the A setting, because if you set the aperture ring manually to an aperture on the lens, it will always use this aperture independently of whether you couple or decouple the settings between still images and movie shooting. So make sure your lens is in the A mode on the aperture ring before you repeat this exercise for yourself. Let's look into a totally different topic, namely silent shooting. Let's say you are a wedding photographer, you are shooting in a church, you don't want to be disruptive, so you want to get all noise eliminated from your shooting. And we already customized here the down button to switch between silent mode on and silent mode off. And if silent mode is off, we have first of all the beep here, and I'm currently also on mechanical shutter, so you will also hear the shutter noise. Let's do this. Beep, shutter noise. Beep, shutter noise. So that's not silent. If we switch now silent mode on, the beep will be eliminated and the shutter will switch from mechanical to electronic shutter. Let's do this again. No noise at all, right? But there is one caveat. If we stop down now, and by the way, let's do this here now again on the aperture ring. So let's say we stop down to an f8, there is some residual noise, which you will hear in a moment. So let me try to get my microphone from my body away to the lens here, and let's try to do this again. Let me just try to get this right. So I move this here to the lens, and then I halfway press the shutter button. Listen to that sound when I focus. Do you hear that noise? And that is coming actually from the aperture opening widely for being quicker in autofocus. So let's have a look and turn around the camera. So I was stopped down at f8. Let's quickly open the aperture so you see the moving parts. Here the aperture gets opened to its widest open setting of f1.4. And if I focus now, the aperture is already wide open and therefore catches sufficient light to get a quick autofocus executed. Let's try to focus by halfway pressing the shutter button. So nothing happens here because it's wide open. If I stop down again to f8.0, and you see it stopped down now, and if I now half press the shutter button, you see it will open. And if I again place my microphone next to the lens, you will hear that noise. So why is it opening? It's opening because it catches more light in that way, and autofocus will have a better performance. And that makes some noise if you open the aperture in the focusing process by halfway pressing the shutter button. Now there is actually a setting in the menu where you can tweak this and get rid of that noise coming from the aperture when it is stopped down, widening up to actually catch more light for the focusing process. And that setting here is under autofocus manual focus and is called Aperture Drive in autofocus. Unfortunately, it's grayed out. And if I press the center button here, it says this operation or setting is not available in silent mode on. And that's what we had here, right? We have silent mode on. So let's switch silent mode off and let's go into the menu again. And now this Aperture Drive in autofocus is actually available and has three settings here: focus priority, so it will open even wider the aperture when it focuses. Standard, that's a balance, and then silent priority. Let me quickly try this out under standard. You still hear that noise. We now need to, by the way, get separately, in separate ways, rid of the beep. And the way to do this is to go into the menu, go into the settings, and then in the settings, we go here to sound option, and then we say audio signals off, and then the beep is gone. We still have the aperture noise. And we can also switch now to electronic shutter. So here we are still on mechanical shutter. Listen to the shutter sound. And we now go to electronic shutter, and we find this here in the menu, in the camera menu, under shutter and silent. And then we can say here we want the shutter silent mode settings. That's currently set to off, but we go now to shutter type and say here electronic shutter. And now all that remains, the beep is gone, the shutter sound is gone, but the aperture is still making that noise. Let me get again the microphone close to the lens so you hear this. It's still there. Now if we go to the menu now and go back here to where we've been before, namely to autofocus, manual focus, let's quickly go there. And then we have here Aperture Drive in autofocus. And now, since we are not in silent mode, but we manually deactivated the beep and switched from mechanical to electronic shutter, this is no longer grayed out. And if I now go here to silent priority, and let me get the microphone again close to the lens, you will not hear that sound any longer. Let's just do this. Now it's completely silent, but you also see it's a bit hunting forth and back on the focus. And that was the warning we just saw on that setting. Let's go back into the menu. And if we go here to standard and then switch back to silent priority, it says the focusing speed may decrease because the aperture in the focusing process is not getting wider, therefore not catching enough light, and that's why your focus slows down. But the noise is eliminated, and that might be your priority once in a while. There is not a big difference between standard and focus priority. I tested this in the past, but you know, if you're obsessed by having the fastest autofocus at all times, you might want to go here to focus priority. And then it says the aperture drive may be audible. So let's also listen to that sound here. If you hear a difference between standard, I don't think there is a difference, but the autofocus feels a bit more spot on and a bit more snappy. And that's the trick I wanted to mention. Total silence in shooting is only possible if you do eliminate the beep by manual tweaking, as well as switching in manual ways from mechanical to electronic shutter, and then in aperture drive in autofocus, focus priority going to silent. You will sacrifice focus speed, but your camera will be absolutely silent. No noise at all. Even if I go with my microphone now to the lens again, absolutely silent compared to what we had before when in the setting we had here. Let's go back to the menu. When in the setting we had here standard and then focused. So that's the way to do it, and I hope that trick is useful to you. It's just one of many tips and tricks I provide in this video. Let's turn our attention to the menu again, and there is one main section of the menu I didn't touch upon yet, and that's the second one here. So if we are up here, we have the favorites, that's the customizable menu, so your tailor-made menu, I covered that in detail. Then we have the camera menu here, and in between is something that's called the main screen. And here on the main screen you have, in the same way as on, let's say, the Q menu on Fuji cameras or the status screen on Leica SL and Leica Q cameras, an overview of most important shooting parameters in one view. It not only gives you the information of what you're currently shooting with, you also can set this up, for instance, by touch or via the joystick or via the control wheel, what have you, and you can look this up. Let's say aspect ratio, for instance, push it, and then you can change your aspect ratio to 16:9, and it will be taken over immediately here. So that's very simple. You have all the information, the essential information you need in one view, and you can also immediately change it if you want. You have a similar status screen or main menu on video mode. So if I switch here now to video mode and go back into the menu, I have different entries, of course, for instance, the microphone level here, which is then matching video mode. So everything I'm going to show under still images also applies to videos here. Let's go back to still images. Let's have a look at that screen. Now, in particular, useful would be if I could customize this, that whenever I push a button, this status screen comes up where I can immediately change my settings in a very convenient way. And that's actually possible by the customization we learned before about all these buttons on the camera body. Let's show how to do this. Let's go on the main sections to the settings. We've been there before. Under pages, let's go here until we come to custom key dial settings for still images. As I said, if you want to change this for the video mode, go to the video custom key dial settings. Then we go here and we choose one particular button here. Let's say here we have, let's see what button I want to have. Let's say button number 5 here, which is C4. And that is the button we want to use. So let's push this here. And now let's go back here into the settings, and then in the settings we find here, first of all, display my menu. That's what we customized sometime earlier in the video. And then we have display the main menu. And if I select this, it's selected here. And now whenever I push here the trash bin button, it brings up that main menu and I can immediately tweak important settings on my shooting parameters, which is quite convenient. Since we covered quite some ground now in the course of this video, let's look into a couple of easy settings, which will be very short in description. And first of all, you have here release without a lens, and you can enable this or disable it. I recommend enabling this because you will immediately see if you have not mounted a lens, but if you don't enable it and you shoot with third-party lenses and third-party adapters, then it will not work if you have switched here to disable. So keep it at enable. That's a setting you should have that way. The next one, you need a word of caution here. Never have enabled shooting or releasing without a card, because your images will end up in nirvana, in nowhere. You will not find them, and you will be under the impression that you have shot nice images, but nothing will be there if you finally want to upload it to your computer. So always disable release without a card, because that's dangerous, whereas a lens you see immediately when you have the camera in hand, whether you have a card inside that slot or not. That is not so easy to see at first sight, so keep this disabled at all times. Let's talk a bit about memory cards, storage and recording settings. First of all, in order to get the best out of the camera, you need to have very fast memory cards. And I use in my camera here compact flash Express Type A cards directly from Sony. Huge capacity, unfortunately super expensive, but also super robust. And I have the same card in both slots. So I have two of them, and that means I can enable here backup recording, which I'm going to show in a moment. You can also operate this camera via SD cards, but SD cards never reach the transfer rates you have on compact flash Express Type A cards. So you are better advised using compact flash Express than SD cards on the Sony a7R V. Now let's go into recording settings, and we find this here in the main section under camera, then in the subsection here under media, and then we find recording media settings. And here you have different options. First of all, on the camera, there is a distinction between recording still images and video, because you might want to have different preferences for both types of footage. Let's look into the options we get for still images. So we can record them on card number 1 in slot 1, card number 2 in slot 2. I can simultaneously record, which is my choice, because then I get the same footage on both cards. And if one card accidentally would break down, I still have all of my footage on the second card. So I will also go for recording media on movies into simultaneous recording. You also get a nice little illustration down here, what you've actually set up here. So let's try this out. Let's go back to still images. Let's say we record them on slot number 1. And then you see here the still images are only on card number 1, which in my setting, which we did at the beginning of the video, is RAW and JPEG in the X-Fine resolution with 60 megapixels. So that's all illustrated here. If I go back to simultaneous recording, it will show that this is simultaneously recorded on both slots. Other configurations which would make sense are the following. Let's say we want to have still images on slot number 1 and movies on slot number 2. So you know exactly where your videos end up and where your still images end up. That's of course one configuration which makes sense. Another one would be to say we have here sort recording and on the still images, and then conveniently here you can go to image quality settings, which carries you back to one of the earliest screens I've shown here in this video. You can also tap on that, of course. Let's say we have chosen here sort recording, then you just touch here and then you get back into the image quality settings. And then we can say, for instance, that we want to have JPEGs on slot number 1 and we want to have raw images on slot number 2. So we know exactly where the JPEGs are for the preview and where the final footage is I want to then work on in post. On image quality settings, I switched now back to the original settings I had at the beginning of this video. RAW and JPEG, RAW uncompressed, then here JPEG quality extra fine and 60 megapixel. Now that screen looked differently when we just jumped into it, coming from recording media. And the reason is, if you go here to sort recording and you go back into image quality settings, then the screen changed. And you see now I have RAW on slot 1 and slot 2 and no longer RAW and JPEG, because now I indicated here in record media settings that I want to sort my footage. And the camera is smart enough to note that, so it changes my configuration here, which I don't want to have. So let's go back here. Let's go again to simultaneous recording. And then if I jump back, my original configuration is untouched in the way I want to have it. A last point to mention here is, if I would say I record everything on slot 1 and do this also for videos, then I can enable auto switch media on. And that means if my card 1 is basically full and all the footage is on that card, there is no more space any longer, then the camera switches automatically to card number 2. I would call this an overflow function. So the footage flows over to the second card if the first card is completely depleted. My configuration here, as I said a moment ago, is simultaneous. This one here is on off, because then it doesn't make sense any longer. And I preserve my image quality settings in the way I set them up at the beginning of the video. The next tip concerns file and folder settings, and that's in the main section under camera, subsection file, which is number 3, and then file folder settings. If you go into that, you can change a couple of things. First of all, you can reset the counter on your images, and typically it's counting up all the time until you reset it. Now I never reset this because it gives me also the shutter count of the camera. So I would not recommend doing this, but if you want to start from scratch with image number 1, that's your way to go. Then you can also have a forced file number reset, and that means that you do a reset on the still image file number and you also create a new folder in one shot. And if you want to do that, if this is helpful for you because you want to have a different way to sort your images, for instance, then this is what you can do here. More interesting for me is set file name. Let's go into that here. And the standard default value, if you take the camera out of box, is DSC, which is typical for Sony. Let's tap into that and let's change it. And what I want to do here now is, first of all, I erase these 3 letters. You only have 3. But what I want to do here is, since I shoot with many different camera brands, I want to have here an S, then I want to have here an O, and then I want to have an N to indicate to me that this is footage coming from a Sony camera. And that's the way to go for me. You might also go for A7R or A7V, what have you, whatever in terms of acronyms is helping you to identify images coming from this particular camera. And then the last option on this page here is the folder name. You can go for the standard form, which is what you typically see when you open the memory card on your MacBook, or you can also go for the date, which can be helpful sometimes to identify immediately when the shooting took place. Another important section here is copyright info. I think that becomes more and more important for pro photographers because people tend to steal your images from platforms, social media, what have you. Now, it's not a perfect protection, of course, because you can edit metadata with suitable editors. But for me, I always do this, and let's quickly do that. So I can tap here. I want to have here math photographer. Let's do this in this way. When you have filled in your information, you can push OK, and then it's stored. You go another time to OK, and that's it. Do the same on copyright, and let's do this here. When you've filled in your information, you can display it by going to this section here, and then it shows you the photographer name as well as the copyright holder name. And you can also write this into metadata by going here to on. And then this is represented in the metadata, and everyone who opens this and has not manipulated your metadata will see that this is an image taken by you. Besides the copyright info, which can actually have an explicit name, like in my example here, math photographer, you can also direct the camera to write the serial number in the metadata, which is actually a good idea because it also is an additional layer of protection. If someone claims that an image is from her or him, and you know that this image is from you, you can verify this in the metadata if it has not been manipulated before via the serial number of your camera. Last but not least, we have on this section here the option to write IPTC information into the metadata of the camera, so you always have a good image management here. And IPTC stands for International Press and Telecommunications Council, and is a standard where you can download the preset from the Sony website and then populate it, for instance, with the models you've used in your shooting, with the location, with copyrights, licenses, what have you. And that all is then stored in the image, in the metadata, which is very convenient. And as I said, it's an expression of good image management. I'm sure you will love my next tip because it will make your workflow and your life much easier. And what I have done now here is, let's go into the FN menu. I have set up this camera now, let's say for landscape, cityscape, for still scenes where nothing is moving, where we don't have to recognize faces, where we don't have sports and action. So I have here, first of all, single shooting in drive mode. I have here autofocus single. I have focus area spot small, I have switched off subject recognition, and so on. And that is a typical scenario I have programmed here, which you use, for instance, for landscape. Now let's say you've grabbed your camera and you walk a city and you do street photography with that setup, and you use the settings you have here. What if all of a sudden you come to a sports and action scene which fascinates you so much that you want to shoot it? Then you have to go tediously into the FN menu and start to tweak all these settings into some parameterization which are suitable for sports and action. And that can actually be done before you walk the city and can store it in convenient ways. First of all, in 3 different configurations in the camera itself, and you can recall it from the mode dial here. There is a 1, a 2 and a 3 configuration marked on the dial. And you can also store 4 more configurations on the memory card, which you then can recall from the memory card if the time is right for changing your parameters for a different shooting situation. So before I now change all my settings here into a configuration which is suitable for sports and action, let's make sure I store this one. And for this I go into the menu and I can choose here camera set memory. And then I get a convenient overview screen with all my settings. For instance here, multi-field metering or autofocus single, which we just saw before. Focus area is spot small, and so on. Everything here is visible in one view, and I can decide now whether I want to store it in the camera and then use the mode dial to recall it. So that would be configuration number 1, 2 and 3. Or if I want to store it on the SD card or the Compact Flash Express Type A card here, and then give it a name configuration M1, M2, M3 and M4. And that can also be recalled if the card with the configuration is in the camera slot. Since I have now stored my configuration for still scenes in memory place number 1 in the camera, let's change now the configuration to something more suitable for sports and action or model photography. So first of all, we go here to continuous shooting high. Then we go on focus mode to autofocus continuous, of course. We go here on the focus area to tracking. Let's go back here. Let's go for tracking wide. We go on subject recognition to on. And we also want to have phase priority in multimetering. So let's get this also to on. And then we are basically good to go. And maybe one more I want to change here is in sports and action, I don't want to have multimetering here. Let's go here to center or maybe even spot. Maybe spot is even better, which will brighten the scene immediately because the face of my model where the focus is sitting is a bit more dark. So that's the configuration I have set up now for sports and action with all the elements I think I need. So we go back into menu and we go here again into camera set memory and we say this goes now into my place number 2. And now it's registered. The camera is now set up for sports and action, but if I want to go to my still scene configuration, I just use the mode dial up here. You cannot really see it, and I rotate it and bring back place number 1. Let's quickly do that. Here we go. And by the way, you see now here, it says memory number 1. So if I go back here on the mode dial, I'm in fully manual mode. Here I'm in shutter speed priority, aperture priority, and so on. If you look here where my thumb is resting, but that's configuration number 1. And if I switch now back into the FN menu, I see it has switched it back to my configuration which I stored. I'm in single shooting drive mode, autofocus single. I'm in spot here. So we are back in the configuration in the way I stored it. If I want to switch back now to sports and action, I just rotate the mode dial one more notch here and then it switches to MR2. And now I'm back into my sports and action setting. You see here, we have here high speed burst shooting, we have autofocus continuous, and we have tracking and all of that. And that's a convenient way to pre-store configurations which you already know today that you might want to use them in the course of the day or the night, and to not having to configure every single parameter all the time from scratch again. Before I close the chapter on configurations and how to store them, let's quickly go through the workflow how to create a configuration and store it on a memory card. So let's go back into the menu, and let's say we can store this here on slot number 1, so card number 1 or card number 2. Let's say it's card number 1, and now let's change very quickly the configuration I have here into something suitable for the Milky Way. So let's quickly do a pre-configuration for a night sky or Milky Way shooting, and let's store them then on card number 1 in slot number 1. First of all, I've set the camera now in fully manual mode here. Second, I want to have a self timer, of course, because the camera will be on a tripod. Let's say a 5-second self timer. I also want to change from auto ISO here to an ISO of 3.2K. So let's quickly go there. Here we go. Of course, we'll not see a lot in a moment when I make the shutter speed slower. And we leave the aperture widest open at f1.4, and we create a shutter speed of, let's say, 15 seconds for a long exposure at night. So let's store this here. All right, I think that's it. On the FN menu, not much to say. We have the self timer, autofocus single, and so on. We have multimetering here, what have you. That's all good. And now let's store this on the memory card. And for this, we go back into the menu and we go into camera set memory again. And then we go now here into the M slots. So these 3 slots, they are for storage of a configuration in the camera. Then here we have 4 configurations we can store on a memory card. And let's say we go for the Milky Way to slot number 4 and let's register it. That's it, now it's registered. The situation now is the following. Let's say I came back from a sports and action shooting, so I'm in MR2 here, so which is the second storage slot for configurations in the camera itself. And now let's recall that Milky Way configuration because it's getting dark and we have a crisp and very beautiful night sky. So I want to prepare the camera up front, although I will tweak my exposure, of course, when I'm on the spot and shooting. And let's go to recall camera setting. And if I go into that, you see here my configuration, which is loaded, is configuration number 2 for sports and action. If I would switch here to configuration number 1, it would show me the configuration for the still scene we configured at the very beginning of this chapter here. And now I go to, let's say, slot number 4. You see slot 1, 2, and 3 are not stored on the card. Let's go to 4, and now I can recall it. And you see all my settings are here. I'm in fully manual mode. I'm at 15-second exposure. It's all stored in the configuration. I have my ISO value of 3.2K. I have a self timer, and everything I pre-configured is in that slot on the memory card. So let's recall it, and then we are back here. And now we can immediately shoot. I will clearly tweak my exposure a bit depending on the situation and the environment I have, but it is all pre-configured and I don't have to do a lot of configuration or parameter settings on the ground in the dark at night. If you like my explanations on how to set up custom configurations, storing them and recalling them, you might like my next tip even more, because there is a quicker way for a short amount of time to access a certain configuration. And let's say for the time being we are here in the custom mode on 1. So you see this here by camera recall. So this is the still scene. I can also go to the sports scene. Let's quickly do that here. And then we have the sports scene, and here we have empty, 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 and here we have the Milky Way. Now let's go back to 1 because that I think is better suitable for what I want to show here. And if we have these configurations, we always have to work with the mode dial and with the menu to recall a certain configuration if it is stored on the memory card. And there's a quicker way of doing this, and I'm going to show this now in the next couple of minutes. So I'm here now in my still scene configuration on camera slot number 1. We also have a camera slot number 2, which is then for sports and action. But say that's the configuration I'm shooting in street photography in a city I've not traveled to before. And now let's say I want to very quickly switch to something more suitable for sports and action without turning the mode dial or recalling a configuration from the memory card. The way to do this is as follows. Let's go to the menu, and then we have a bit of a cryptic menu entry, which is called registering custom shoot set. As I said, sometimes the wording in these Sony menus is not very fortunate. But anyway, we have 3 configurations we can store here, and let's go for configuration number 1. And now we get different things we can recall if we hold a custom key. So we are going to assign this to a key, and we can first of all have here the shoot mode. So we can go here to aperture priority, let's say. Then we have the aperture. The aperture I think is with f5.6 good for me. The shutter speed, because we are in aperture priority, will be chosen automatically. Drive mode, we want to have here continuous shooting. And on exposure compensation 0, ISO auto is fine. Metering mode, we want to have here spot. Let's say this time center. Focus mode is, I think, in continuous autofocus. And the focus area is tracking, so we go for wide. And the tracking sensitivity is standard, and so on. And that is a configuration we can now register. So let's do this. Here we go. This is registered now. And now we need to find a suitable button where we can recall this. And for this, we go into the menu. And we've seen this before, how to customize buttons and control wheels. We go down to the very last main section on settings. And then we go down here until we find custom key dial settings. And we can now go here. We are in still image shooting. So let's say we want to have here, let's go down here a little bit. First of all here, let's say we want to have this on this button here. So C1 is the right one, and let's assign it. So I push the button here, and then we go here to the camera section on the main section, on the subsection to shooting mode, and we find here recall custom hold 1, and we choose it. And now we are good to go. It's registered, it's up and running. And when I'm now back here in the main menu, you see I still have here configuration 1, which is my still scene configuration with all the parameters in the way I set it. And if I want to now quickly switch into sports and action, I just have to press and hold the button C1. You see, it changed now immediately into the sports and action mode, which we also have stored as a configuration here. And it stays in that sports and action mode, which I pre-configured and just recalled by pushing the C1 custom button as long as I press and hold. If I let go, I'm back in the still scene configuration, which we stored before. Here I'm back in sports and action. Here I'm back in the still scene. And that is, of course, a very quick way, changing a lot of parameters with just the push of one single button. And I'm sure that is something which will make your workflow easier. Let's do something fun now, namely a focus pull, or in other words, smooth focus transitions in video mode. And that is something which can create very nice, very creative effects. I'm here now on the video mode. I'm in aperture priority, as you can see here. My shooting parameters are simple. We have 4K, autofocus continuous, that's important in video mode. We have the wide tracking focus area and all these parameters. By the way, I also have subject recognition and autofocus on. And I have Yennefer here from The Witcher, and she's a good model for trying out what I wanted to demonstrate here. First of all, I can tap now here, and then Yennefer will stay in focus, and it also tracks the focus. If I would move Yennefer now, it will track Yennefer no matter where I move it, and that is of course quite convenient in video mode. But now I can transition the focus to the background to Darth Vader. Let's get this done. Here we go. You see how the transition worked. Let's go back to Yennefer. And that is of course very nice. Now I can also tweak this, and there are a lot of settings in the menu which help me to tailor-made customize this for my own needs. The first parameter I want to talk about is autofocus transition speed. And there's a range here from 1 up to 5. And 5 is very fast, as said here on the LCD screen. So let's try this out. Let's go back into live view. Let's transition. Very fast, you see? Very fast, probably not very creative because you want to have a longer, smooth focus transition. But smooth it's anyway. So let's go back here and let's tweak this to the slowest setting. And you will see the difference is huge here. So let's go here. Let's do this again. And let's transition focus now to the background to Darth Vader. See how creative this looks. Very cinematic if you go to a slower transition speed here. Looks really good, is a lot of fun, and is, by the way, very hard to do in manual focusing. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but there is something interesting going on the controller LCD screen here when we do these focus transitions. First of all, I'm in autofocus continuous, as you can see here on AFC. And the moment in time I do the transition, it stays on AFC until it found focus. And then it will switch to MF for manual focus. So let's have a look. It's still on AFC. Now focus has been found and it switched here to MF for manual focus. And that means I can override now with the focus ring wherever the focus is sitting, which is quite interesting. And by the way, it's also still tracking here because we still have focus cancel up. Let's transition back to Yennefer. And again, it switches into MF, so I can manually adjust if I'm not happy with the focus and the result, or can add another creative effect, which is quite nice. And I thought I should quickly mention that I stopped the focus tracking by pushing the center button here. But there are more interesting parameters to tweak here on subject recognition and autofocus transition. Let's go back into the menu. And we covered autofocus transition speed. We are on continuous autofocus. That's all fine. But here is autofocus subject shift sensitivity. And that goes from very responsive down to locked on. And probably a good compromise is here, the 3 in the middle. But what it actually does is something we should try out. So let's go to the extreme on the right hand side, value 5 responsive. I have someone coming from the sideline now and moving into the frame. And so far the focus still is sticky on Jennifer, but if I block Jennifer, the focus switches to that guy and also stays with that guy, which is quite interesting, right? So it stays here on the other face coming into the scene because it's catching attention, it's moving, and it blocked Jennifer for a moment. If we now go back into the menu and change this from responsive, where autofocus is quickly to change from one subject to the other, to locked on, let's see what happens then. So let's bring in the guy from the sideline. Let's do this again. Here he comes. Nothing happens. Let's block Jennifer. Nothing happens, right? It still stays on Jennifer. You see that? I can block Jennifer as much as I want, but it will not catch up and will not move the focus or steal the focus from Jennifer to this new guy. And that's what happens if you are here in the menu on locked on instead of on responsive. Let's go back to responsive. Coming in here, the other guy, blocking Jennifer, catching the focus, stealing it from Jennifer, and also keeping the focus. You see, that's the difference in the menu if you are on responsive versus locked on. And I think that's worthwhile to know because it will help you to tailor-made the way your autofocus is reacting in videography. The next setting in the menu is Autofocus Assist, and that's a very simple feature I can cover in a few seconds. If it is off, and I have my focus here sitting on Jennifer and I turn the focus ring, nothing happens and I cannot fine-tune or adjust my focus. It's just the automatic autofocus which is finding Jennifer and her face or her eye. If I activate Autofocus Assist, so we go here to on and my focus is sitting on Jennifer, I can now overrule with manual focus on the focus ring here. And that is the only difference. If I deactivate it, it will be gone, off, and I can no longer use the focus ring and override the focus, which was found automatically by finding Jennifer here in the scene. Let's spend a bit more time on subject recognition in autofocus. First of all, I've switched it on. Second, I have as target here human, and that worked quite well with Jennifer here in the foreground. But we also have here animals and birds as a collective target. We have animals isolated, birds isolated, insects, which is the first time I've seen this on a camera actually. And we have cars, trains and airplanes. And the A7R5 is the first camera of its kind where so much artificial intelligence and so many tracking targets are embedded in the way we see it here and can tweak them in the menu. On this particular page of settings, I want to provide a few more tips and tricks. So first of all, we have here right and left eye selection. And I have this on auto currently. That means it's a bit at random. Whatever the camera thinks is closer, that I will get priority. But I can also steer this in a directed way. So let's go here into that. And let's say I want to have the right eye always. Then you see it will get sticky on the right eye. And I can switch it now to the left eye by going into this again and pointing at the left eye. And then it is the left eye. So that's quite convenient. And depending on your preferences, you can tweak this or leave it to the camera to decide, and typically it will pick the eye which is closer to the camera. Then we have subject recognition frame display, and this is currently on off. I recommend to keep this on. I mean, here the eye is the one which gets the focus, so there is no frame here in addition, but under certain shooting situations and parametrizations, this will show a frame around the subject where the focus is sitting. And then an interesting one is face memory, and I want to quickly illustrate this by means of Jennifer, which shows how good this algorithm is working, that it even memorizes and recognizes the face of a figure from The Witcher and not even truly a human face. So let's get Jennifer a bit closer to the camera, and then let's go here into this setting here. And let's say, you see we have here 8 storage places. Let's say we want to register Jennifer's face. Now I cannot move that rectangle. I really need to carry the camera now to the face in order to recognize it and store it. Let's focus here. Let's push the middle button. And then it says register. Now I can register it and can say this is Jennifer's face. So let's go here. Let's bring this back into where it was before. Register. and now the face is registered. And if you look here now, we have one face, and that can help to even better lock on the autofocus to a certain person you know in the scene where you are shooting. So let's try this out and let's see the effect of face registration for subject tracking. And we have here another menu entry which is registered face priority, and that is currently switched to off. And I show you what happens if this is switched to off compared to what happens if it is switched to on. If I switch face priority on, let's see what happens. I have in the scene now placed the other guy in the foreground and Jennifer a bit in the background, but it's recognized here with the face and the eye. Let's now pull the focus to the guy in the foreground. So this is now in focus and tracking kicked in. And now let's cancel the focus tracking and let's see what happens. Focus switches back to the registered face. That's the priority I'm talking about, which I just activated here in the menu. Let's now switch this off and let's see the opposite effect. So here again, focus is sitting at Jennifer. Let's pull the focus to the guy in the foreground and let's cancel the focus, and then focus stays with the guy. And that's the difference I'm talking about here, and that menu entry really makes a difference for registered faces, in this case here on Jennifer's face. The next entry then on the list in subsection number 4 is focus map. If you switch this on here, you get a color coding on what's in focus and not in focus, and you can look up what color means what. Is actually sometimes quite helpful, but in general more confusing me than helping. But it shows nicely the foreground, namely Jennifer, which is here in focus, and then there is, as I said, different coding on the colors. I typically have this switch to off, but a more useful tool is the focus magnifier. Let's activate this here, and then I can go here and see how sharp actually my subject is and where I believe the focus is sitting. And that is quite useful, and that is best placed by assigning it to a custom button. So for instance, if we would go into the menu here and we go down in the main sections to the settings, and then we say here on the subsections, let's go down here to custom key dial set on video, and let's go here now to the down button. Here we go, that's the down button, and that follows currently the menu we have in still image shooting, but let's choose this here, and then let's go here on the main section up to autofocus manual focus, and on the subsections let's go here to focus magnifier. So here it is, and let's select it, and now it's activated here, and whenever I'm in live view in video mode I can push the down button and then get my magnification and see how nicely Jennifer's face is in focus here. You can also specify here the focus magnification time. I have this on no limit because I decide with a push of the center button when I want to get out of the magnification mode, and you can also say what the magnification is, and I have this at 100% here, which is what you will later see in post. Then on the next page we have focus peaking, and that is something I use mainly in still images, not so much in video, but you can switch it on in video, and I have it here on high instead of mid or low, and as a color I've chosen blue. And if you do that, you see immediately with the focus peaking what's in focus and what's out of focus, namely the background here. Very easy, very simple, but I typically use this more for still images and not so much in video. That's why I switch it off here. And by the way, the setting and the functionality, the parameters you can tweak are exactly the same as in still images, so I cover this only here in the video section. There is a big difference when it comes to subject tracking in video mode compared to still image mode. And I'm here in video mode, and I have here wide area tracking, we have autofocus continuous, we have subject recognition on, and we still have Jennifer's face also registered. And here in video mode, I don't need to have my pointing finger on the shutter button. The focus will update the moment in time I move Jennifer, and as long as I stick to my minimum focusing distance coming from the lens I have mounted, I can move wherever I want. Jennifer will always be sharp because it's the only moving subject here, and focus doesn't get distracted by anything else. That is different in still image mode. Let's go to still image mode. Now if I half press the shutter button, it recognizes the eye, and Jennifer is sharp and crisp. And if we go into the FN menu here, I'm still, in order to compare it, on wide tracking and autofocus continuous. I'm here in single shooting in drive mode. That doesn't matter for my demonstration here. So if I move now Jennifer here in still image mode, focus will not automatically update. It will become blurry, and the focus plane was fixed once I focused on her eye. And only if I get back to this focus plane, Jennifer will be halfway sharp. If I here want to track, I need to have my pointing finger on the shutter button and half press it down. Have a look here. Now if I keep half pressing the shutter button, the focus is sticky on the eye and it sits where it sits. And then we don't have any problem. It will always update the focus. So that means if you do a burst shooting, in a model shooting, for instance, in still photography, you need to have your pointing finger on the shutter button, or you configure it for autofocus on, which I have here. Let's do this. And then I can conveniently just use back button focus here, which is also doing the trick, and my pointing finger doesn't need to be on the shutter release button. Next, I want to provide a mini tutorial on autofocus and focus settings. And I'm here in still image mode, but a lot of what I'm saying is also applying to video. And once you've understood the principles, it's very easy to carry this over from still image photography into videography. I'll do my explanations by means of the menu, but for a lot of these functions, I showed before how to set up custom buttons here on the camera body, or using the FN menu or the main menu or my menu with your favorites, what have you. So let's start here with focus mode. And we have in focus mode, we have 5 different options. We have single shot autofocus, which is good for landscape, of course, and still scenes where you don't have moving subjects. But most of the time, if you're on street, if you're a wedding photographer, if you're doing a model shooting, what have you, you need to be on either automatic autofocus or continuous autofocus. I actually recommend to go to continuous autofocus because it gives you more control. In automatic autofocus, that's sitting somewhere between the single shot and the continuous autofocus. The camera, based on the intelligence embedded into the camera, will decide by itself whether it shoots single or continuous. And that's not what I want. I want to determine myself whether I shoot in single shot autofocus or continuous autofocus. So most of the time you will be on continuous here. Then we have direct manual focus that allows you to override autofocus by adjusting and turning the focus ring on the lens. And we of course have manual focus, which I use most of the time for night photography as well as for macro shootings. Let's quickly try this out in order to understand what direct manual focus means. And then there's also a setting in the menu I want to quickly show. I'm here in autofocus continuous now, and when I half press the shutter button, it focuses, and if I simultaneously turn the focus ring, nothing happens. But if I go to DMF, direct manual focus, and then half press the shutter button, autofocus kicks in, and if I now, when half pressing the shutter button, rotate the focus ring, I can fine tune my focus in a magnification view, which is quite nice. In all other focus methods here, if I go for instance to autofocus single, this doesn't work, only in DMF. So half pressing the shutter button here and turning the focus wheel, nothing happens. But there is a setting in the menu where you actually can get direct manual focus in all of these settings here. So in AF single, AFA, AFC, and so on. And that's something I want to quickly show here. It's on the first page in the main section autofocus manual focus. If I scroll down here to the second page of subsection 1, it says full-time DMF. And this is currently switched off. So as I just showed, when I'm in autofocus single, for instance, half pressing shutter button, nothing happens. But if I switch this on here, then I have always the option to overrule my autofocus by manual focus. So let's switch it on. Let's try this out. Still in autofocus single here, no DMF chosen, and then half pressing the shutter button. And now I can overrule with my focus ring here the autofocus and try to adjust this better by manual focus. And that's the way it works. I typically have this on off, although it's a nice feature, because when you hold the lens and the camera in hand, accidentally turning the focus ring is very easy. And I think the autofocus on this camera here is highly reliable, so I don't need that. But if you want to have the option to always overrule by manual focus, then this clearly is the way to go. The next two menu entries are about priority set in autofocus single and autofocus continuous. And that helps you to determine the trade-off between getting the shot done and having your subject in focus. And most of the time you will have this on balanced emphasis. But if you say, I'm happy to risk that some of my shots are waste and will not be sharp, you can go for release and that increases speed, or you go for precision and then you go for autofocus. I have this most of the time on balanced emphasis because the camera does a good job in deciding itself what to do. The same actually in autofocus continuous. Then I covered already in the video mode before when we talked about focus and focus pull, autofocus tracking sensitivity when we played between Jennifer and Darth Vader. And that's the same in still images. Just remember that in order to track, you need to half press the shutter button, as I explained before. And that's the trade-off between being locked on in terms of focus on your subject, or being responsive and happily switching to something else that moves in the scene. And I think balance is good here, unless you have any particular shooting situation where you want to tweak this yourself. Autofocus Illuminator has two options here, auto and off. And auto means the camera detects whether there is enough light for focusing, or it switches on that tiny little LED on the front side of the camera to illuminate the scene a little better. And if you have it on off, that's of course if you don't want to have that disturbing light coming up, and then you just switch it off. I have this typically on auto because I don't care about that little light which helps me to illuminate the scene in front of the camera. When I spoke about silent shooting, I in detail explained Aperture Drive in autofocus. And since I don't care a lot about some aperture noise, I want to have focus priority and in this way get my autofocus on steroids. And that's what you also should do if silence is not a big topic for you. I'm not a wedding photographer. I don't care if my aperture makes a bit of noise. And if I can boost performance by going to focus priority, that's clearly my preferred setting here. Below full-time DMF, there is one more menu entry I want to show in this context, and that's pre-autofocus. And that's currently on off. And I showed before that whereas in video mode, if you have your hands off the camera, autofocus will always update to the subject, like here, Jennifer in the scene. In still image photography, you always have to half press the shutter button for tracking and to catch the focus. If you have activated here pre-autofocus, then this is almost like in video mode. And let me quickly show that. So here we have autofocus now at this particular position where Jennifer is standing in front of the camera in the scene. But if I move Jennifer, then after a while, pre-autofocus will kick in and it will automatically focus on the face and the eye of Jennifer. Have a look here how focus is updating. This is actually almost like what you've seen in video mode before. And this of course a feature which consumes a lot of power because autofocus is permanently active and permanently updating the focus. And that's why I have typically switched this to off. But if you care about a super quick autofocus and the autofocus already pre-adjusting where it later will sit when you have pressed the shutter button, then this of course is a very nice feature because it keeps the camera in terms of autofocus updated all the time. And whenever you have pressed the shutter button, the focus is already sitting where it's supposed to sit. So it will accelerate your focusing process, but on the flip side of the coin, consume a lot of battery power. And that's why I have this most of the time on off. Let's talk about focus area. So in focus area, we have wide, we have zone, we have center fix, we have spot, and in spot we can adjust here between small, medium and large. And then we have here expand spot, and we also have here tracking expand spot. And here also you have some options kicking in. I'm currently in single shot autofocus, so tracking expand spot will not work. And in order to make this work and visible, I have to go here to AFC, and then I can actually also choose that option here. Let's go here again, expand spot, that's where we dropped off. And then we have tracking expand spot, and here we can also choose between different options in terms of wide and so on. And these autofocus areas, they are very important to understand in order to get the best out of a scene when you're shooting, in particular in a situation where you want to track subjects. Let's quickly go through these different choices under focus area so you understand what that all means. And I have two options now. I don't want to half press the shutter button all the time in still images, so I can either switch on here pre-autofocus, but that is not as quick as if I switch to video mode, and everything I'm going to say on focus area applies in the same way to still images and videography. So I will switch here to the video mode, and then my focus is permanently updating. So the first option you have here is wide, and wide is also a good mode for tracking, but it works in particular well if your subject is isolated. If there would be many different people now coming into the scene, autofocus can very quickly get confused and not picking maybe the subject you want to have in focus. And we saw this before on the different menu options here, what we can choose. For instance, on subject shift sensitivity, and then you can try to improve it. But if there is a populated scene, a crowded scene in front of you, focus will very likely not end up where you want it to be. So if you want to be more specific where your subject is, where you want the focus to sit, you can go, for instance, to zone. And then you get here an indication of a rectangle in the middle of the frame. And whenever the subject you want to track or focus on is in that frame, focus will find it. And of course, if I move out of the frame, autofocus will not update. It still recognizes the face, but it's not updating in the same way as if I would be in the frame. So here I'm out of the frame. You see Jennifer is not sharp. The camera focuses now on the background. If I bring Jennifer in again into the focus zone, then autofocus finds Jennifer and also finds the eye here. There are different things I can tweak in the menu here. So for instance, this rectangle here is now indicated in a white color. I can also give it a different color here under focus area color. Let's go on red. And then you see that rectangle is red. I typically have white because red for me means not in focus and is kind of an alert. That's why I don't like the red color here when I actually know that the focus will have found Jennifer. So I go here to white. Then we have here circulation of focus point, and currently the focus point is a zone in the center of the frame. And if I go here and look at that, you see that rectangle indicated. I can move it. I can move it to the left, I can move it to the right, and in this way become specific about on which particular part in the frame I want to have my zone. I can move it up, I can move it down and all of that. And if it comes here to the right hand side border, you see, no matter how much I torture my joystick here, that's end of story, and the same here. And what you can do with this circulation of focus area or focus point is, you can say circulate, and then when it moves out of the frame here on the right hand side, let's do this quickly, it comes back on the left hand side in. You see how it is circulating now? And that is a feature you can turn on. I don't use that very often, so I typically have it here on does not circulate, but it is an option you have, of course. And by the way, let me quickly show that it also works in vertical direction. Let's go back here to circulate, and now I can move my frame, and now it comes again at the bottom. It leaves the frame at the top and comes back at the bottom. And that is something you can tweak here in the menu. The next choice or option here on focus area is center fix. And that means you have here a small rectangle. You cannot move it with the joystick as we did before with the zone. And whatever is in that center as a subject can actually find focus. If I move it out here, then it starts to focus on the background because it's no longer in that center rectangle here. If I move Jennifer back, then focus will be found and focus will be pinpoint sharp on Jennifer. And the same works, of course, in the other direction. There is absolutely no way focus happens outside of this center fix rectangle here, and that's the way it works. You can use this, of course, for focus tracking, and then recompose. There are many ways you can do that, but you are restricted to the center of the frame in the meaning of the word center fix. The next focus area is spot, and spot comes in three sizes. We have small, we have medium, and we have large. Let's look at the different sizes here. So this is small, this is medium, and this is large. Let's go back to small here because that's my most widely used application. And you can move now that focus field also here. And the way the increments are when it jumps to the right hand side or to the left hand side can be tweaked in the menu. So first of all, if I have the field somewhere else, I've set up my joystick in a way that whenever I push it, it jumps back to the center of the frame. The increments can be tweaked here. So we have autofocus frame move amount, and this is on standard, so it jumps in these increments. Let's get it back to the center. If I go here to large, then the increments are larger. Let's have a look how this looks like. So here you see now it's larger. And by the way, if I want this to circulate, I can also activate this like I showed before here and can say circulate here. So now if I move that focus field, it leaves the scene at the top and comes back at the bottom. And the same, let's center this again. On the right hand side, for instance, it leaves the scene here and comes back here. And you see also if your subject is not in that spot field here, then it will not catch focus. Now it catches focus again. So it's quite simple. And of course, if you can tweak the size here by medium or large or small, and if you can tweak the increment here, how this is moving, let's go back to standard. And if you can also tweak this to become a circulation here, if it comes to the borders of the frame, you have a lot of optionality here. Let's try this once more. We move the field away. Now the camera focuses on the background, for instance here on my Nikon C9. And then if I get the field back here to the subject, then Jennifer is in focus. Let's center this again and let's look into the next option, because the next option is a close relative. It's expand spot. And the difference is if we are on spot, you see that rectangle here. If we go to expand spot, this will enlarge a little bit. And you see here now an indicated rectangle around the spot or this focus field here. And if the camera doesn't find focus on the inside field, it expands with autofocus points to the outer boundaries up to this rectangle here. Expand spot can be moved in the same way as spot, and everything I applied in terms of going into circulation or into the amount this moves can be tweaked in the same way as I showed before. Now I'm currently in the video mode, and in the video mode, that's it in terms of focus area. We have wide, we have zone, we have center fix, we have spot, small, medium and large, and we have expand spot in the way I showed in the last minutes. In still image mode, let me switch here, we have one more section here. So we have here, let's go, wide, zone, center fix, that's all the same as in video, spot, small, medium, large. We have expand spot, and we have tracking wide, tracking zone, tracking center fix, tracking spot, small, medium, large, and we have tracking expand spot. So in still image mode, we have more options here to choose than what I just see here in video mode where we came from. And as far as I see in the web and in blogs, that confuses a lot of people. And I will quickly explain what's going on here. So let's stay in still image mode for a moment and let's explore this last focus area option here, namely tracking. And let's go here to, let's say, spot small. If I now half press the shutter button, it will find the eye of my model and will focus on Jennifer's face. If I would go here to standard spot, that will not happen. It will stay on the body, on the chest of Jennifer. It will not jump to the face. So let's go back here to tracking, spot small, and then you see if I half press the shutter button, it jumps to the face. And if I continue to half press the shutter button, it will now track my subject. My subject can move in the scene and tracking kicks in a very nice way. And tracking in the way I just showed is then applied to all different choices here under tracking focus area. So if I'm in wide, if I'm in zone, if I'm on center fix, if I'm on spot, small, medium, large, or expand spot. Let's try this with expand spot. And then we have this additional indication of a rectangle with expansion of autofocus points. If I half press the shutter button, it finds the eye, it will track my subject, even if it is very quickly moving, and it's very sticky on the eye of Jennifer here. Let's go here, for instance, to zone. So let's go to zone. Then you see this large rectangle here applied. Let me half press the shutter button. Let me continue to half press the shutter button. Tracking kicks in. And in this way I can have very nice burst shots, for instance, in sports and action or in model photography, and use this tracking feature in still images. Now the question is, what happens in movie mode? Because if I'm switching here back to video, that option is not available. Let's go here into my options again. So we have wide, we have zone, we have center fix, spot and expand spot. There is no tracking here. And the reason is that tracking in video mode works differently, which I'm going to show now quickly. In order to show you how tracking is working in video mode, I went here to spot small to have a very precise field where I'm focusing here. And clearly, if I half press the shutter button in video now, it jumps from the chest to the eye here and recognizes the eye of Jennifer. But what I need to do to track now is, and there are two ways to do it. The first one is I go into touch function in shooting in the video mode and say not touch focus, but touch tracking. So let's do that. And let's move Jennifer out of the frame. So Jennifer becomes blurry and the camera focuses on the background based on that small focus field here. And now let's touch on my subject here. And then Jennifer becomes sharp and in focus, and the face and the eye is recognized. And now it says here tracking cancel. That means I'm now in tracking mode. Let's move Jennifer a little bit. Let's see how sticky this is, even if I move quickly. Let's cancel tracking, and then tracking will stop. And if I move now Jennifer out of that focus field range again, it becomes blurry. So that's the way this is working. Let's catch the subject. Now we are in tracking mode. Now we can move the subject, so whatever is happening in the scene with that subject is captured in terms of autofocus. And if I want to stop tracking in video mode, I just push the center button here. That's the first way to get this done. There is a second way I want to quickly show, and if we would not be here in the menu on touch tracking, but just on touch focus, then it will no longer track. So let's have a look here. I get on my subject, I move the subject, there is no tracking, the focus field is static and nothing is updating in terms of autofocus. Having said that, I still have touch focus, although it's not tracking, so I can touch my subject and Jennifer here is then in focus again and the face and the eye is recognized. Now, the second way to get tracking up and running in video is to assign tracking to a custom key. And we can do this in the menu, and we saw this before. It's the last main section, then it's here subsection 3. Operation customize, and we have here the custom key dial settings for video. If I go into that, I can now choose a certain custom key, let's say C3 here. So I go down here, follow the orange marking on the camera illustration. Here we are. It's button number 4, and then I push the center button here. And then we go into autofocus manual focus here and in focus area. And here is a setting called tracking on toggle. If I choose that, I have now the same functionality I had before. We are touch tracking, but now with a custom key. So first of all, let's move Jennifer out here. So it's not sharp, it's blurry. Let's move her in. So focus catches up with Jennifer. And now if I push that custom key here, C3, which we just assigned for toggling on the tracking, you will get the same message here as what we saw before on touch tracking. Let's get this done. Now you see tracking cancel. That means as long as I don't push the center button here, now Jennifer will be tracked. Focus will stay with the subject and also will recognize the face and the eye. And I can cancel this then in the same way as I did before in method number 1 via touch tracking by pushing the center button. And then if I move her out, she's no longer there. Let's center the field. Let's do this once more. So I can touch here. We go in toggle on tracking. Then we can move Jennifer. Focus will be sticky on Jennifer, then we can cancel the tracking, and then Jennifer will get blurry because the focus field is here. That's the second method you can do for tracking in video, and there is, I think, no other way to track in video than these two, touch tracking or by assigning a custom button with toggling on tracking. I think in this long video I covered the main features you really need to know and understand to operate this Sony a7R V successfully. But I want to provide one more hint because I was not able to cover every single menu entry here, of course, and this video, of course, is getting very long. It's the longest video I ever posted on YouTube. So what can you do if you find a menu entry like here, for instance, in the main section playback, and it says display as group and you don't know what it means. And there is an embedded help function on the Sony a7R V, which you can activate by pushing the trash bin button here or delete button. Let's do this. And then it says display as group means sets whether or not to display images shot with continuous shooting or interval shooting as a group. And now you know what it is. And that works with all menu entries. Is a very smart way to always keep your manual for the camera with you because it's already embedded in the camera. And that particular setting, if you do, for instance, a time lapse and interval shooting, it will mark the images and will provide them clustered as a group, which is very helpful later in post if you want to sort everything out. And the same works with all the other buttons here. Let's go here, for instance, to, that's a very cryptic one, display specified time image. If you don't know what that is, just push it. Displays the image of the specified date and time, which is another way to sort and manage your footage. And that's the way it works. I hope you liked that video. I know it's a very long video, but since I provided more than 100 sections where you can directly jump to it, I hope it is very useful for you to select the content you are specifically interested in. If you liked that video, because it's a lot of effort, I would be grateful for your thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Help to spread the news about the content I'm providing by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out and Happy New Year.